remove the children. Best strategy ever. Cruelest. Parents have no reason to live once you take their children. You don't know if they're ever coming back. A good percentage of them didn't. What about them? They fell into deep depression, darling. What do you think? That we watched our kids go to school never to see them again and then rejoiced? What if they suddenly took all your relatives' children away from them? Look what's happening in the United States right now.
But what do we call you? But what do we call you? You know, human being, Anishinaabe. You can call me Anishinaabe. You can call me Eddy, if you feel like calling me something. But who am I? I'm Anishinaabe.
I wanted to speak to Indigenous people in Canada about what colonialism really means to them. Beyond its definition, I wanted to find out what kind of weight it carries in Canada.
But who am I? I'm Anishinaabe. And we have spirit names in our language, and we have clans within our language, and that's who I am. He asked me what kind of Indian I was, this artist that was visiting our school. And I said, I didn't know. I didn't know what kind of Indian I was. And then I went home and asked my grandfather, and he said, you're Ojibwe, you're Anishinaabe. He grew up speaking 3 dialects of Ojibwe, but he never taught me. Who we were and who we are as Indigenous people, as Anishinaabe, was not within the home.
I grew up not knowing my culture. I grew up not understanding really who I was or who I am today, not being immersed in the things that I could have or should have been, which is sad because it's beautiful. It's wonderful knowing now, but I feel like it's a different feeling growing up with that sort of culture as a child.
My dad was a fluent Chipewyan speaker, a Dene speaker, but he also attended residential schools. As a result of attending residential school, he was made to feel shameful for who he is, for having long hair, for having brown skin, for speaking his language. So much so that he left the community as soon as he was finished with residential school and went to Vancouver.
The myth that colonialism is over is problematic. Colonialism is that ongoing paternalistic laws and policies that intentionally keep us removed from our land, exclude us from decision making about our lands and about our well-being, and create that sort of tiered relationship and citizenship status between Indigenous people and other Canadians.
Right now, in a lot of rural communities, there is still the issue of clean drinking water, and so we saw with Attawapiskat, for there being a state of emergency, which is that northern rural First Nations community. And if you see the photos of these children who have skin rashes from cleaning themselves with water, like, I think a lot of Canadians take this for granted, that I can just go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, and drink it. In a lot of these communities as well, access to healthcare is a huge issue. So like in Prince Rupert, they have to fly down to Vancouver. I know so many First Nations people who've had to fly down to Vancouver to get adequate healthcare services. When I talk about those services, I'm also talking about upholding basic human rights.
For someone that comes from an area on reserve and in communities, is that a lot of these issues that you see are from failed federal policies. For example, the Indian Act is alive and well. I'm not defined by it, but I do know the issues that arose from it. So for example, if you look at some of the infrastructural challenges in the communities, right now, the clean water and the housing issues, it was an attempt to break down the population to encourage enfranchisement into towns and cities in Canada.
A lot of Canadians might have kindergartner understanding of colonialism and don't really understand that there are still systems of oppression in place. So it's just something that, like, as Canadians, we have to be open to listening to. And on top of that, it's not Indigenous people's responsibility to share their trauma, but they have. There's so many testimonies out there of Indigenous people sharing their traumas and sharing their story. So to ignore it is shameful. Having privilege is not something that most of us can control, but what we do with information once we have acquired it, that's something that we need to take responsibility for.
When you're talking about assimilation with Indigenous people, the cultural mosaic and the protective factors of the culture is still present. So how do you remove culture from a population is that you remove children. So when that was implemented, you started seeing the mandatory enforced removal of Indigenous children from home. So in my story, like I mentioned, my direct experience, my mother, grandparents, and even my late great aunt I mentioned were part of residential schools. My uncles, my grandparents didn't see my uncles for 6 years, and they're forcibly taken from an Indian agent. So, but when you look at that, the system doesn't stop there.
A recent study has shown that mothers who lose a child, whose child dies, have better health outcomes than mothers whose children are apprehended. Right? We know that the impacts of taking children is devastating. And so that's not left in residential schools, right? We know that there's more children in care right now than there were at the height of residential schools. In places like Manitoba, where I'm from, 90% of the children in care are Indigenous, even though less than 10% of the population in Manitoba is Indigenous. That's insane.
Parents have no reason to live once you take their children. There's no reason to pass on culture because there's no children. There's no reason to teach the language because there's no children. You don't know if they're ever coming back. A good percentage of them didn't.
I think when we look at the 5 criteria of what genocide is, that you kill members of a community, you cause serious bodily harm to members of a community, bodily or mental harm, I think. That you deliberately inflict conditions of life that are intended to prevent the well-being or the death of a group. When you impose measures to prevent births, and when you forcibly transfer children. Those are the 5 criteria of genocide. And remember that genocide also is less than 100 years old as a specific concept and definition. So when we look at that historically, absolutely Canada's committed genocide, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. It's been happening for so long, over the course of so much time, that can't be genocide. One of the critiques is that, it has to happen quickly and swiftly. We have to, the time element was sort of a big critique from people, but that makes no sense. That leaves an incredible logical inconsistency, which is, well, that what you're saying then is that if you just kill people slowly over hundreds of years, that makes it less bad. That makes it less genocidal because of this time element.
To say that there wasn't a genocide and that there isn't still one taking place would be a disservice to those who have died from it or who have endured it or who are still being targeted by it.
Truth and Reconciliation and the 94 calls to action can be a medium for us as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to meet, to develop a relationship. But also it could be a vehicle for, Canadians to elevate their collective consciousness. It can be an opportunity for us to come together and work and move together in the same direction.
It's not about reconciliation. It's about, people say this, it's about conciliation. How do we make things right, period, from the beginning? There's nothing that we can go back and say we're restoring a relationship. We're not restoring a relationship. I don't think any Indigenous people want to restore sort of, these colonial relationships. What we want is to have a brand new relationship.
Reconciliation is about fixing the bullying that we underwent. Severe bullying. I have 4 dead sisters. You can't give them back to me. You can't reconcile with me. I have 4 dead sisters. And then I had to raise my dead sister's daughters. 2 of the daughters of my sisters died. One of the nephews killed himself. One of the daughters of the sisters was brutally beaten to death by some crazy white guy. No, you can't reconcile with me. But if you give us the funds to reclaim our language and our culture and our literature, our storytelling traditions, our clown traditions, our thinking traditions, our medical traditions, and they're all written about in all of my books. It's easy to find.
A meaningful consultation means listening and being responsive. It's not a gesture, right? I think buying a pipeline while simultaneously talking about Indigenous rights and reconciliation those are incompatible things. It means returning land and jurisdiction and power to Indigenous peoples to make these decisions. And that involves letting go of power, right, and privilege, and people don't respond well to that.
So a friend of mine that I actually went to school with uses this, 3 points, and a lot of these things have been used around the world, but I mean, is just sit and listen to the stories and testimony with every part of your body, with everything, with your spirit, with your heart, and then learn from the testimonies to what has happened, not to what's wrong with us or why can't they get over it, but to what has happened to these people, these nations and nations of people across North America. And then once you've learned what has happened, how can you put that into action? How can you put that into a movement and momentum? Is that through your own learning journey? Is that through supporting things? Is that through reading books or listening to interviews and podcasts? How are you going to put that into action?
But I am proud now to say that I am Métis and Two-Spirited, and I love wearing that as a badge of honor.
The work that I do is important, but I think on a very another avenue is to have things that help you heal. So this is what I do to heal. So for when I carry a lot of energy, like I'll just play, like even hearing the chords and the sound, the sound resonates to help me process and let things go.
But if we can flip that algorithm and that frequency on another level to positivity, to occupying space. Well, I'm going to occupy this space in this system. It's with indigeneity. Well, I'm going to function within this space from a place of an Indigenous thought. Well, I'm going to start placing my Indigenous presence in this non-Indigenous space by just being there. And by just being there, I'm bringing my ancestors with me.